took an approach that's called ECID, Enhanced Critical Incident Technique. And that's research that asks people to think about a critical moment in time, an event. And so, for participants, they might be thinking about a job that they got or didn't get. For employers, they might be thinking about a particular employee that they hired that worked out or didn't work out. But we look at thinking about that event. What helped at that time? What hindered or made it more challenging? And if you had time for a do-over, if you could have other resources available, what do you wish that you had available for you in order to smooth the way in that process? So that was how we gathered the information. And then the analysis looked at putting the responses into categories. And so in each of these categories, there might actually be positive responses, things that helped. Like obviously, opportunities would be helpful, but responses related to lack of opportunities would also have gone into the opportunities cluster. So not all of these factors are representing, only success stories, but instead these are categories that the responses fell into, which is a little bit different than some other research results. So if we look at these categories, then opportunities for sure came up over and over and over again, as you can imagine, particularly in rural communities. But related to that were the specifics of rural realities. So rural realities is a big tent that a lot of these other things, of course, were influenced by. But they were the comments and the statements and the questions that came up very specific to we're in a rural environment. Access to training and learning opportunities came up. In many cases, to engage in training or learning, people were going to have to move away or go away. And once they'd gone away to another community, perhaps they didn't return. And so we saw in a lot of the rural communities, and this has gone on for a very long time. I remember when I lived up north, that people were moving away and then not coming back. And so the community was not sort of keeping its youth and young families. The realities of work environments in rural communities came up over and over. That it's not like having, a big building with an elevator in downtown Vancouver, but employers were concerned about the kinds of accommodations that they might be expected to make or that they could make. The work environments also impacted even our access to employers for focus groups. They rarely showed up for focus groups, but if we went to them with cookies or donuts, then we were able to have conversations with them. But many of them were run by one or two people who couldn't just shut the business to come to a focus group. So they, whether there were customers in there or not, they still needed to be available in their workplace. Another category that came up was fit, awareness, and within awareness, there would be people understanding some of the challenges, but also lack of awareness came up there as well. The need for accessibility and accommodation, and again, positives and negatives came up in that category. People feeling overwhelmed by, what might be expected in accommodation, and then very often from some of the job seekers, just descriptions of the very tiny, reasonable accommodations that would have made their work possible. Communication did come up across all of the groups. The challenges related to bureaucracy and trying to navigate some of the complex systems, and we'll talk more about systems in a few minutes. Respect came up as a really important category, and when people felt respect on both sides, when employers' needs were respected as well as employees' needs and job seekers' needs being respected, then there were very positive outcomes. But many of the stories indicated lack of respect and outright discrimination. There was the importance of connections, and also the acknowledgement that in rural communities, some of the connections were very complicated. So if your uncle had a bad reputation in the community, then you weren't going to be employed by anybody. Or if you had one negative experience, as many people do when they're entering the workforce for the first time, they're learning what the expectations are of the labor market. But if you're in a small community, word spreads. And so it's going to be more challenging to get that second job or that third job. There were financial themes that came up in conversation. The need to earn a living wage, and yet many of the jobs available, much of the work available in rural or remote communities might be part-time or might be episodic or seasonal. The importance of flexibility, and as Cassie already talked about, adaptability on both sides, again, on all three sides. The interconnectedness of the community, the motivation, again, on all parts. If motivation was there, then really good, positive changes happen. But in some places, there wasn't motivation, or there was a perceived lack of motivation. Interpersonal skills made a huge difference. And again, those interpersonal skills were in all three groups. So people talked about how welcomed they felt by the community service providers, or how welcomed they felt, or how open a particular employer was. And we also heard the opposite. We heard stories where people were not welcomed, and where the language used did not make it a safe place to be. As I mentioned before, discrimination sort of permeated many of these other categories, but also came out as a category of its own. It came up so often, and some of the stories were really quite horrifying to hear. The category of collaboration and what a difference it makes to really pull together. And we saw examples in communities that really were working together to make it a good place and a safe space for everyone. Transportation, not surprisingly, in rural and remote communities, but came up as a theme. And in fact, the day that I was on site in one of the rural communities was the day the bus wasn't working. The one bus. And the one key for the one bus had been lost that day. And so there was no bus service for anyone. And that was just, has stood out in our heads as such an example of the realities in rural and remote communities. And then also, finally, the category of authenticity, the importance of being real and being able to bring your full self to work. So those are, in a nutshell, the themes. What we would like to do is give you an opportunity to work with them in a couple of minutes. And so what we're going to do is introduce here a systems-based approach. So some of you might be familiar with Bronfenbrenner's work. He talked about these concentric circles. So with the individual in the middle, and then the next circle is that individual's immediate environment. So their home, perhaps their workplace, perhaps if they're a student, there's their school, but all of the systems that they're immediately connected with. The circle beyond that, the orange circle on this diagram, is what's called the mesosystem, but really it's the interaction of those other environments. And so a quick example that comes to mind would be the interaction between your workplace expectations for hours of work and your daycare's expectations for when's the last moment that you can pick up your child. And so the interaction of those systems, or you're at work and your child is doing a presentation at school that you really want to be at, or you may have two workers in a family, and the interaction between the expectations of both sets of employers. So that adds some complexity in our systems. And then the green layer talks about the blue layer talks about the formal and informal social structures. And so that might be our local governments, it might be the expectations, the norms, things like access to transportation. And then the green layer is the cultural or the social elements. How do we do things around here? And what would be considered normal? What would be considered expected? What would be considered acceptable? And then the purple layer acknowledges that there's change over time. And so we recognize the historic nature of some of these influences. And, related to that would be the intergenerational trauma that we recognize in some of our communities. And so this systems-based approach influenced our thinking of how to look at these categories. So when we go to the next slide, you'll see that at a very broad level, some of the categories seem to have to do with the individual, their characteristics and their needs. That's over on the right-hand side. And so, an individual might have specific needs for accessibility or accommodation, the need to bring their full self to work. They might have financial needs. They might have awareness or need to become aware and learn about new things. They might need flexibility, motivation, some training and learning opportunities. But we also recognize on the left side that there's lots of contextual factors that are beyond the individual. So when we're thinking as career service providers, we could be thinking about intervention points. And the focus in my career has largely been on working with individuals early on. That was really our focus. And then as time has gone on, many more of my interventions now are at a contextual level. So trying to influence bureaucracy. Janet mentioned that many of the webinars in this series are trying to, help take the recommendations to the folks that can change the rules. Looking at the context of discrimination that many of our participants were facing. Fit is a contextual factor. An individual can't fit on their own. They have to fit into something. And so that something has to be ready to accommodate and be safe and welcoming. The rural realities, of course, are contextual: transportation, the work environments, the training and learning opportunities, and so on. But then also this middle cluster of relationships really talked about the importance, as Cassie mentioned earlier, of communication, of interpersonal skills, of collaboration, of connections. Discrimination fits there in the relationship category. Fit also does. So you can see an overlap of some of these, and respect.